everyone. I hope everyone's doing well today. Happy, depending on where you are in the country, happy almost spring. Here in New York, where we have a nice week ahead of us, continuing of nice weather. And so just thank you again for joining us. And so today we're going to be talking about language-based learning disabilities. We are joined by Dr. Hoffmann and Dr. Saigal from the Child and Family Institute, both neuropsychologists, and Samantha Feinman, who is the director of New Frontiers Executive Function Coaching. And I'm Casey Schmaliker, operations manager at New Frontiers. So always, I like to just start off with some logistical stuff. We have some guiding questions to start off the conversation, but we want to get to the things that the audience members will find useful. So please use the questions dialog box to submit your own questions to guide the conversation. We'd love to be speaking to the things that resonate with you and that will have the most impact with you. But if anyone's just a little shy and doesn't want to ask questions, we do have questions to guide the conversation today. I am launching a quick poll. So if you could just complete that so we understand the makeup of the audience, that will be super helpful. And there will be a recording of this. So if you know anyone as you're listening that you're like, oh my God, I wish they were here, just wait for the follow-up email with a YouTube link and you can share it with anyone. We want this to go to as many people as possible. So I'll give it, we got 80% voted. I'll give it like 15 seconds, see if any last stragglers get in. Interesting breakdown. So we have 88%, and I say this every time also, the percentages don't add to 100 because you can vote for more than one. But 88% of people here are 89% are professionals, and 33% of people are the parent of someone beyond college or younger than elementary school. So we just have this other branch, but not currently in K through 12. So I'm going to close the poll now. So it's heavy professionals with some adults maybe reflecting on their children's experience or adults wanting to learn more about themselves. So just to get us started, and Kristi and Preeti, you guys can fight over who wants to answer first and complement each other, but start us off with what are language-based learning disabilities? They're fairly common, but I would love just to hear like a setting the table of what are these things that we're talking about.
Kristi, would you like to go first, or I don't want to interrupt it?
Sure, no problem. No problem. So language-based learning disabilities are what they consist of, or what makes them, are neurological differences in the way kids learn to read, write, and math is a part of this as well. So when you're looking at the DSM-5, what we would call these disabilities are specific learning disabilities with impairment in, and then we specify reading, writing, or math. And there are various types of, so for example, a specific learning disability in reading, that's a very, very broad term and can mean many things. So there's different breakdowns within the reading process. And so we would identify it that way. So these are all disabilities that make it difficult for a child to learn in the same way that their peers are learning in the classroom. So they have the same access to the information. So it's not an access issue. They have the same opportunities, but they're experiencing difficulty being able to understand the information and work with it in the most general sense in their classroom setting.
And so what are the different parts, Preeti? Yeah, so Preeti, so like what are the different parts of language? So we hear language and immediately people think of oral language, talking to each other. But is that the only one? Like what are the other ways that language-based disabilities are impacted?
Right. So I think Kristi did a great job sort of summarizing it. And I think if we think of it in a, sort of break that down into a really simple sense, it's really people who struggle with, the sort of understanding or expression of either spoken or written language. So it's how you take it in as well as how do you put it out. And kids can have, or adults can have difficulties with how they express themselves, either in written or orally, written format or orally, or how they also then comprehend or take in that information. And there's, I should say take in, I don't want to say comprehend because that's one aspect of language, but how that information comes in, so that can be reflective of phonological, and we'll talk a lot about these, but how sounds are heard. It can reflect comprehension, how things are understood, and how and reasoning, how well, I guess reasoning is a bit like comprehension, but how they sort of take in and understand language, how they hear it, and then expressively, how do they put it down in writing, orally, things like verbal fluency, getting your access to the words that you may know, and how do you produce that, and how do you communicate information, yeah, I guess I don't want to ramble, but those are some of the ways. And so there's a lot of sort of avenues that different students can struggle with, and that can then have implications for development of reading skills, writing skills, and as Kristi pointed out, math skills as well, because there is a lot of language components in understanding mathematics. So, depending on where a child is age-wise and grade-wise, there's different implications for how we want to intervene and address, and what the underlying causes of what their difficulties are in terms of how we want to intervene, and how we want to provide them with the right types of supports, and instruction and accommodations.
And so
Exactly.
just before I pull into, yep, go ahead,
Yeah,
Kristi.
no, I mean, at the most basic level, what Preeti just said, it's listening, comprehending, speaking, reading, writing, and then the math is a part of that. So it's really, it's pretty much anything that you can think of when it comes to communication, and whether it's oral, written, but it's all along those lines.
And so just before I pull in Sam, I wanted one more like neuropsychological question. Does this also impact self-talk, like the voice we hear in our head? Because we are talking about like engaging with the outside world via language, but is there a component of how we engage with ourselves with language? Like, have you guys had any experience with that impacting that self-talk? And you can hear the executive function coach coming out with me as we talk about cognitive modeling and stuff. But is that something that is also impacted?
So I would say that, Preeti, do you want to go ahead?
Oh, no, I mean, I was going to say absolutely, yes. I think that, again, it's how you are using language to communicate ideas in one form or another. So that certainly can have implications for not just, the classroom and learning, but in terms of organizing your thoughts. And exactly, you took the words right out of my mind, Casey, in terms of that executive piece, that can, again, we're focusing on the learning disabilities part of it today, but that has implications for how we communicate with others, how we communicate ourselves, how we organize what we're thinking, and how does that come out into the world. And that can, have social implications in terms of interactions, and how you sort of manage the demands that are coming to you. So very much executive functioning is very much a part of that. And again, I'm sure Sam and you can take this, but when we get to some of those remediation things, again, understanding some of the underlying causes in terms of what are driving some of those difficulties, I think then has implications for how we remediate some of those difficulties on the executive function front. And, I'm sure we'll get to that more later, and you guys will be able to speak to that quite well.
I always think about, like, when you're encountering a problem, you say, well, what went wrong? Oh my God, I just used language. Like already, like the first step of what's so, like, societally how we go about this stuff, so much is based in language. You think about giving directions without language. It's very, very difficult, and leading on some other things. But yes, we'll talk about how to kind of bridge that gap. So Sam, I know you also have a little bit of a SLP background, a speech language background as well. So I know in coaching, when talking about accommodations, which we'll get more in depth, but a lot of what Kristi and Preeti were just talking about was there's the input phase, there's the processing phase, and there's the output phase, the kind of production phase of language. Why is it important to not just look at, like when learning challenges come up, why is it important not to look at it monolithically? Why is it important to get down into, is it what's coming in that's getting messed up? Is it how they're interpreting it, or versus how they're expressing themselves and using language? Why is that important from a learning framework?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, I think, language is incredibly fascinating because it's a very complex system. It's a complex system of really arbitrary rules, an arbitrary rule system that we've kind of created, or people have created, that they share. These rules are shared by a group of people in order to communicate effectively with each other, and whether that be through writing or whether that be through speech. You have to follow this underlying arbitrary rule system in order for people to make sense of what you're saying or writing, or for you to understand what others are saying or writing. And it's very complex, not only from the level of input and output and processing, but also from the sub-levels of where we can see a breakdown in understanding or misunderstanding the rule system. So, we have things like we were talking about before, phonetics, right? There are certain, we have our language system has connected sounds to symbols arbitrarily, but we all learn that certain sound symbol combinations, when they're put together, are a symbolic of something else. So you have a phonetic system, you have a syntactical system of, so then you put those sound symbols together in different order to make sense of what you're trying to communicate, right? Subject, noun, verb. You can't, we don't, in the English language, we don't put our verbs first, we put our nouns first typically. So these are all syntactical systems, again, arbitrary, that we have to learn. Semantics, right? This is a pen, right? Nowhere was it ever written that this has to be a pen, right? We've created, again, a symbolic representation that we share. And then all of that nonverbal, the pragmatics, the eye contact, the social, social distance, all of the things that go into helping an individual to share whether or they are engaged and understand, or not engaged and don't understand. So it's a very complex system that can break down at several different levels, whether it be receptively or expressively, at different subcategories. And it's really important to understand all of those complexities, because this is how we gain information and demonstrate that we understand information. And so it's really important to understand where that breakdown is, so that we can remediate those specific areas, so that people can communicate effectively, but also understand information coming in. You can see, like, it's a precursor for being successful in school, for sure, because we access school by understanding information, learning information, and then being able to communicate that we've learned that information.
And I think that's so interesting, just because, like, I always like the example of sometimes frustrated parents, sometimes it's frustrated teachers that might not be as aware of these disabilities, of, he just never listens to me. Well, is it actually he's not hearing that, he's not receiving the language? Is he, and I'm using he in this example, is he interpreting the message wrong, or is he a slower processor, so it takes longer for it to be interpreted? Or is his output communicating back to you? Maybe he's not using the right words or the right language in the right context. But there's so many assumptions filled. We jump right to he's not listening, and a lot of people don't know what they're really describing, because they don't know the different parts of language usage in the brain. And that's something I see all the time. So we've kind of talked about what it was. And so Kristi and Preeti, I'd love to hear, like, what are some of the signs to be kind of looking out for. And then I'd also just to get to some of like, what are the terms that professionals use to describe these that are a little bit more specific for either the professionals that are here or for any parents that are here to gain more context. So if we could just start with some of like, what are those symptoms and signs to be looking out for, and then what are some of the labels that are used to navigate the space?
I think that age is important here because you're going to see different signs at different ages. And because, as Samantha just said, language, reading, writing, all of these things are a process, and the breakdown can occur at any given point. So for example, with a really young child, you may see that they have difficulty learning and saying their ABCs. And that may, whereas most kids, they might pick it up in a song and can sing that. Other kids, they may get the letters mixed up. They may have trouble. They may have difficulty learning just the letters in their name or writing their own name. So at a very young age, you may see confusion with letters, difficulty identifying those letters. If we're talking about maybe as a child is getting a little bit older and learning to read, then you may see that they are having difficulty learning their sight words. They're having trouble memorizing those words and learning them, or spelling, all of these things. And then as you get a little bit older, you can have kids that develop those processes nicely. And I'm speaking more about the reading side in this example, that may have no trouble learning to identify words and the sound symbol relationships and reading, but then they have difficulty comprehending what they are reading. And that's a different part of the process, the reading process. So again, it depends on the age and what skill set's appropriate for that age, but you can see it kind of along the way. Same with writing. Back to the basics of being able to write your letters out, write your name out, and those things. And then we'll see difficulty with kids as they have to then learn to put sentences together, create a paragraph, write an essay. They may have difficulty expressing. They may be able to tell you orally exactly what they want to write, but then when they have to translate it to paper, they may have no idea how to organize those thoughts in an efficient way that makes sense as if you were reading, an essay to someone. So again, lots of different things. Same thing with math. You can see kids reversing numbers, difficulty setting up problems when they're writing out calculations, and along the line, moving forward with having difficulty extracting information from word problems, knowing what is important and what's not. And then that's the language side as well. So you can have the calculation piece, and then you can have the problems with word problems when the language may kind of just add to the confusion and difficulty with manipulating the language-based information. So it's a wide variety of things that I would say that you could see, and it depends on the level of the child.
Right. I think also, just to kind of go back to those, since I think we do have some early childhood parents here, I think one of the things, obviously, when we're talking about kids younger than 4 or 5, we're really talking about the language delays, right? And so Kristi used a great example of not learning the ABCs, but you want to be on the lookout for early childhood signs of, perhaps they aren't babbling by a certain age. Are they not stringing words together in a sentence? Are they having oral motor trouble with articulation, saying certain sounds, hearing sounds? And I think also this is where meeting with a professional to do a thorough and kind of a more astute intake is important, because I think what happens with young kids too, with familiar adults, they will seem like they're communicating very well, but they may be doing it a lot through nonverbal, pointing, gestures, sort of routines that they have. But when you actually have a conversation with a parent about are they able to respond appropriately to their name? Are they able to kind of verbally specify things that they want using the correct vocabulary or pronoun or things like that? So those are some of those early signs of trouble with language and navigating language. And so that way, we might want to be looking more closely at the hearing, more closely at the language, and all of those things. So that's where I think sometimes in early childhood, it's easy to kind of get masked a little bit because because with familiar adults, they'll develop a lot of compensatory strategies, and of course the caring parent will learn the needs of their child or maybe anticipate the needs of the child, but actually the language exchange is not happening. And this sometimes can even happen with kids who have older siblings who do a lot of the talking for them. So those are things I find in early childhood that I really actually, want to walk through a family and be like, provide me with examples. What do they say? Really kind of get some of those behavioral observations to see what does the exchange actually look like, and how much is being relied on by pointing, gesturing, versus actually being able to say some of those words, and having a sense of how many words they should have, and by certain ages, how many 2-word phrases, 3-word phrases that they're stringing together. These are sort of, again, the underlying components that we look for that can potentially develop to language-based learning problems with reading and writing and so forth that we'd want to address early in childhood.
Yeah, and I want to clarify too, because I think it can be a little confusing as we kind of jump around a little bit, is that there are different categories here. So we can have language disorders, and then we can have learning disabilities, and they are not necessarily one and the same, and you can have both. And when you have a child who's pre-elementary school, we're not diagnosing learning disabilities at that age. They have to have had access to learning how to read and write and do math. So those things kind of come into play a little bit later. So a lot of what Preeti was just discussing, that was the language issues, I think are the kind of the first step with the really young ones in picking up whether or not there's a difficulty with language. And it also doesn't mean necessarily that if a child does have language delays, that they're going to have a learning disability. Yes, we do know that there's a higher risk for those things, but it doesn't, the two are not, equated with one another. So I think that that's important to kind of put it out there, that we have, because we're talking about language-based learning disabilities, so we kind of have to look at that as a big umbrella, and then realize that we have speech and communication disorders underneath that, and then we also have the learning disorders within that. And so again, and you can have multiples, you can have each, but it doesn't necessarily always play out that way. You can have one and not the other.
And also, just to clarify for everyone in the audience, it's not any one of these things. The coming together of a full picture. So it's not like you see one thing, like run for the hills, like sound the alarm. But just listening, I could immediately say, well, that could also be manifesting from. And so some of those areas, that's where comprehensive assessment can help shed some light of like, is this really what I'm seeing? And so also, I just wanted to ask.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Preeti. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think, just to circle back on something, Casey, that you touched on when you sort of led into this question was, then again, once children get older, it can really, we have to do an assessment. What's noticed often is some of those more behavioral manifestations of trouble navigating language. So they're not paying attention, they're not listening to me, they seem distracted, they're not following instructions. And so that's where the assessment really helps us parse out what might be happening in those various, those are just sometimes the behavioral manifestations of those issues. And we have to really take a closer look to understand what might be driving the trouble paying attention or trouble following instructions and things like that.
And also, I just want to clarify one more thing. The learning disabilities really, it's not being able to do these things, or it doesn't have to be, like not reading, not communicating. There is a learning component to those, right? So if you never learn to write, that doesn't mean you have a language-based learning disability. It's just, you might learn it differently, or your brain does things differently than other people, so you might just need to learn it separately. I guess what I'm saying is, like, language-based learning disability doesn't have to equal I can't read and I can't communicate, and I can't read and I can't communicate doesn't have to equal a language-based learning disability. Right?
No, so I think so as I said in the beginning, access is a big piece. So for example, if you had a child who was very ill their kindergarten year, okay, and they missed a lot of school for whatever reason, or there was something that kept them from being in the classroom and having access to their teacher and the learning materials, and at the end of the year they're not performing where they should be. We can't say that that's a learning disability because they did not have access to the education. We're talking about kids that have had access to the education, and they've had the ability to be present in a classroom. It doesn't, and this is the difference, it's not necessarily access to a great education, it's just access to a good education program out there. And then if they're struggling within that, if they are still showing differences, and it's not black and white in I can't read versus I can read, there can be very subtle differences that make up each of these learning disabilities and how they present themselves for each child. So it's not a yes or no. And you can have, as I said, you can have a child, I find it's actually not as uncommon as people might think. You can have a child who can read. They can read fine. They're performing in the average range, maybe the lower end of average range, but they can't read words the way that we would want them to fluently read words. So the breakdown can occur at any point in time. So they may have been a kid who knows enough and can get by and has used compensatory strategies. They use context and semantics, so they can kind of get what they need. But all of a sudden, we're now leaving middle school, we're going into high school, the text is so much more complex, and we're seeing this breakdown, and they're not performing in the way that maybe they used to. And so that I get that call quite a bit from parents saying, what's going on? They can read. But then when you break it down and look at the process, you see, you know what, they're missing some of those foundational skills. It's not automatic and fluid like we would hope that it might be at this stage in the game. So again, it's not always a yes, no, black or white in terms of the skill set being present or not. And so that's important to consider when you're assessing a child.
And I think also, a good example of this is perhaps children who have any physical deficits or disabilities, right? So if somebody has an inability to see what's in front of them or hear, or, I come from a background with kids with various physical disabilities, and they might have motor difficulties, they can't move hands or certain things. So again, if they can't write or read, it's not because perhaps they actually have that type of disability, it's that they have another disability that's preventing them from making progress in that, and we have to work with it that way. So again, there's a lot of things that could be happening, but I feel like that's sort of a good example of a child who might not be making progress in one of those academic areas, but the reasons are different than a true reading disability per se.
I'm so happy you brought that up. And it's a perfect segue to the question I wanted to ask Sam. I love using the deaf or blind example, not because I'm happy people have this, but it makes it concrete for people to understand. If someone is deaf, you don't try to talk to them to teach them language. You use reading and writing as your platform to teach it. Language-based disabilities, that's why we started with that. Let's break down the different parts to it, because it's just as concrete, but it's a little harder to figure out where is that concrete breakdown. So Sam, coming from this education point, how do these impact learning, and why is it important to know sooner rather than later where the disability is manifesting? So think we could even run with the concrete example of knowing if someone is deaf or blind is very important for how you're going to instruct and help them in the learning process. So why is that important? I guess starting off, how does it impact learning? And then why is that important to identify sooner rather than later? And we'll loop back a little bit later with remediation conversation, but you can start introducing that a little bit now.
Yeah, so with learning, when children are younger, they're learning language. And so they're learning all of these rules of how we communicate. So when children are, from birth to upper elementary school, really focusing on learning how to read, how to write, how to do it in a way that they can communicate both receptively and expressively. And so a big part of what they're doing through elementary school is learning language. And then there's a shift when they get to middle school where they are expected to use language to learn material. And so if they haven't mastered language by 6th, 7th grade, what we start to see happening is that they begin to lose the ability to access the curriculum because they don't have the language skills necessary in order to comprehend the material they're expected to learn through the use of language skills. And so it's incredibly important to figure out at a very early on if a student isn't developing language skills properly or at an age appropriate level, so that we can focus on remediating those skills as soon as possible so that they don't lose the ability to be able to access the curriculum when the expectation is that they use those skills to do so. And you know, even at that point when they're required to use those skills, if they're lacking those skills, we need to be very clear about what skills are in particularly that they're lacking, so that we can provide a good balance between remediating those skills so that they have a better chance of being able to access the curriculum, but also putting into place supports so that the language deficits that they are demonstrating don't become a deficit to their ability to access the curriculum, because we don't want them to get behind. So it's a balancing act by that point. It's how do we remediate these skills at the same time as ensure that they don't get in the way of learning.
And so there was a study that I often reference, and I think you actually showed it to me, Sam, about like the paradoxical nature of those who seek out and ask for help need it the least. They don't need the help as much as those that don't seek it out. And so where does, like, it's the first thing I work on with any clients is self-advocacy, identifying problems and asking for help. And so how does that just become even more synergistically bad for these learners? Like now they're in 7th grade, they don't know what they're reading, they can't understand what's happening in the classroom, and now they lack the output because it wasn't targeted to teach them how to just ask for help. How does that become such a self-fulfilling prophecy? And what is that when clients come to you? What does that look like when they've just skated by until 12th grade? They're getting ready for college. What does that look like?
I mean, I think that a lot of times it's not necessarily having a good understanding of where they have to utilize cognition in order to make this happen. So, you know, let's take a student that maybe doesn't have a good understanding of sound symbol combinations, and it takes a lot of effort cognitively for them to put together sounds and symbols and to make sense of words. If they're using all of their energy to sound out words, they many times have no energy left to comprehend the material, right?
Yes.
So we want these processes to become much more automatic. If those processes don't become automatic, they could read, but they're not, but the reading is not automatic where they can focus their energy on the comprehension. There's no energy left for that comprehension. So having these conversations and helping learners understand who they are as learners and what they're struggling with can be very helpful when it comes to motivation, so that they can understand why do I sit here for hours upon hours reading, and then when I'm done, I don't even understand anything that I read. That can get very frustrating without that underlying understanding of what's going on in your brain and how your brain is processing information. It can be very frustrating, and it could be, you know, it can lead to a very fixed mindset. No matter how hard I try, I just can't do it. So forget it. I'm not even going to bother to try anymore. I can't change this. Whereas, you know, understanding why you're struggling, you know, can make sense. We have, Casey, you know, many times we have clients that we work with that, you know, they're real good talkers, right? They could talk an essay and use the most beautiful, eloquent language, you know, and and vocabulary words, but then you ask them to put it to paper, and it's at a very, very lower level. And so for them to understand that they're processing information, their speech, you know, their expressive communication via speech takes a different level of energy than having to take it from here and putting it on a piece of paper. And so when they start to understand those processes, they understand that, okay, now I know how I learn best and what my strengths are, and now how do I capitalize on those strengths so that I can, you know, I can get the essay down verbally, but then in writing, and that it equals each other. So, you know, it just helps them to be able to understand kind of the tricks of the trade to use their strengths in order to demonstrate that they can do the work.
And just to continue just an education lens for one other quick minute, what is the difference, Sam, between accommodations and remediation? I think everyone thinks them all the same thing. It's all remediation. Right. It's all because I'm stupid and I'm different. But it's an important discrepancy, and I think it's really important to explain the difference to the individuals receiving it. So what is that difference?
So a lot of what we learn is through modeling and practice, and so language falls into that category. We learn language through seeing language happening, modeling it, practicing it, and identifying patterns that we can then generalize to other circumstances in language. So for instance, we learn that the letter C makes the k sound. And so not only in the word cat, but in color and in various other words. And so we learn language through that practice, that repetition, and through that generalization of that sound in that position will sound like this. And there's always exceptions to the rules, but we learn those things as well. Sometimes individuals have a hard time generalizing those skills, picking up on those patterns just through natural engagement in the environment, and they need remediation in order to develop those skills. And so that is learning discreetly what the language skills are and how to utilize them in different contexts. So when somebody has a language-based learning disability, remediation helps them to catch up on the skills that they're lacking. Accommodations help you to access the environment and support your access to the environment while you're developing the skills through remediation. So that's why you need that good balance, right? You don't go from having a reading disability to not having a reading disability through, you know, a week of remediation. It's a process. And so while going through reading remediation in, let's say, middle school, a student may need accommodations because the environment requires that they use reading to learn. And so they're learning how to read through remediation, but they're also provided with accommodations to access the curriculum because of their lack of reading skills.
And I also want to add,
go ahead, Kristi.
I just wanted to add that there's also modifications that can be done within the school system in addition to the accommodations and the remediation piece. So, for example, modifying the amount of work that a student has to do, you know, whatever that might be, or modifying the amount of, let's say, you know, kids are completing a 20-question test, but for this particular student may have a modification where they're answering a 10 or 15-item test. The modifications depend on the, you know, what the disability would and the reason for it, but so you kind of have that piece too. So you have the remediation, modification, and accommodation within the school system that you can use to help the child.
And I mean, Sam and Kristi have summarized it very well, so I don't have much to add here. But I think, again, I say this often, I know we have a group of professionals here, so I know they probably know this, but there are far more accommodations besides extended time. So I just, you know, I think that's the one that everybody thinks of. But really, you know, extended time, if somebody's struggling with certain things, that's just more time for them to spin their wheels. So accommodations are really, this is where understanding what is underlying the difficulties is incredibly important, so that we can really make accommodations that really support their learning, make recommendations for remediation and modifications based on their learning profile. And so, and that goes well beyond just thinking of, you know, I think people hear the word accommodations and they think, oh, I just need extended time. That really is not the solution for a lot of children. And it's just more time for them to get frustrated if we're not helping them perform better. So, you know, and there's a variety of what that can look like based on the child's learning profile.
Absolutely.
And I think just generally, go ahead. I was just going to say, generally speaking, I think we're really good at remediation and we're really good at accommodations, but we're not so good at balancing the two. So like many times you see, like, you know, students will get a lot of remediation, but they fall behind in the curriculum, or they get a lot of modifications, but nobody's addressing the underlying deficits. And we just have to get better at balancing both of those things so that we can move students towards independence and being able to develop these skills, but not spend so much time in that area that they miss out on accessing the curriculum while they're working on those skills.
And I think that speaks to something Sam pointed out earlier, is really the importance of taking into account where the student is developmentally, grade-wise. So I think you gave the example of the seventh grader earlier, Sam, and so that's where we really have to look at where is this child in their learning, so that we're making the appropriate types of that balance of remediation and accommodations based on what the demands of their environment are.
And I want to throw out, I'm a big analogy metaphor guy, so I'm going to throw out one. When I talk with clients about accommodations specifically, or even remediation, if you threw me into China and expected me to be able to navigate the subway system without knowing the language, that's similar to having a language-based disability. You don't have access to the forms of communication. An accommodation would be having a little translation book next to you, or having a guide that can translate the language for you. That's an accommodation. A remediation would be teaching me how to access and learn the Chinese language. And so I use that as an example because just because it's a foreign language, I didn't have access to learning it. Language-based learning disabilities, or you don't have access to learning the language. And so it's just a very concrete thing that separates those two. And so we have two questions. One that's a little specific that I wanted to see. I haven't heard of it. I quickly looked it up. It's called Kurzweil 3000 and other types of software. And so Kristi and Preeti, I don't know if you've had other softwares that you've recommended to support. Is there any other ones? Have you heard of that one? Are there any others that you recommend to people that might be coming through?
Kristi, do you?
When you're asking about software, what do you, in
so
reference
this
to
is like almost like a read and write goal that helps
Okay.
with dyslexia, dysgraphia. So as an accommodation to access those materials, I don't know if you guys, and if it's okay if you don't, we can always follow up afterwards, but is there anything that you guys like recommend to families?
I'm cautious to say. I do know Kurzweil, and I know some others. I think again, this will really sort of come back to understanding what are the child's. It's with the software. I think it's always. I'm cautious to say too much because at the same time, I think again this goes back to understanding what's underlying a child's learning weaknesses, and then making the appropriate recommendations based on what their needs are. So, you know, for example, like there is like one like Inspirations, which uses a lot of visual representations for writing, that helps with kids with writing weaknesses, and that's one I like and I've recommended before. But again, we haven't touched on this because when we think of language, we always think immediately of things like sound and comprehension and some of those constructs that we've already discussed. But there is a smaller subset of kids with reading deficits that have more of the visual issues with the visual representation. This came to my mind as you were talking about the Chinese language and having like a guidebook or a sim. If somebody struggles with actually the visual interpretation of the symbols, and again, because this goes back to what Sam said at the very beginning about we've created these constructs, we've matched symbols with sounds, and so if that's part of the issue, then and there is maybe struggle more on the visual representation, right? That might not be a software I would recommend for that student. So again, I think there are a variety of things that can be helpful, but I think again this really kind of speaks to more it is really important to sort of make the recommendations based on what we know about the child. So I wouldn't want someone to dive in. I think there's a lot of, it's not uncommon for me to sort of pluck out different tools from different techniques or softwares or things based on what we know about the profile, as opposed to saying this one thing will work really well for a family. So I'm nervous to say that, to say too much.
It's that whole child bit is so important.
Yep. A lot of these programs take different approaches too. Some have a top-down approach, some have a bottom-up approach to how they're teaching and strengthening these skills, and it's not always it's not a one-size-fits all, as Preeti just said. So you have to know the child, know what their cognitive abilities are in addition to the weaknesses that they're having, and use that to customize the treatment program or the software that might be appropriate, because they're not all equal.
Right.
So that's important too.
And accessibility is so important. Are they actually going to access it? Do the individual like it?
Some are paid. Some school districts have access to some do not. So it's, again, you have to, I think you need more information about that specific child before you can just kind of put this
and
out there.
I think another important piece of this is sort of consistency. So, again, we always look at a child, who they're working with, what they're using in the school, because we want the child to not get confused. So there's the follow-up when we get to those end of the evaluations in terms of communicating, our impressions to, let's say, a school, so that they can take those impressions and develop their sort of treatment plan or remediation plan, or giving it to people like you and Sam, who then sort of see our results and use that to guide your intervention programs. Because again, we want there to be consistency between what they're maybe getting in school, between the people that they're working with them, and so that it's less confusing for the child. Otherwise, if 3 different people are doing 3 different things with each other, that's just going to be really confusing. And so I think that's, again, another reason why, our role in terms of as the neuropsychologist, I think, is really to kind of outline some of those underlying key things that we see as driving it, and then working with, communicating that to the people that are working with the child, and based on what tools they have at their disposal and what we have and the people working with them, to come up with a treatment program that's consistent and understandable, and then allows for some measure over time of being able to then follow that child's progress, so otherwise, if one person's doing one thing and another person's doing another thing, a child might not be showing progress on whatever measure somebody else is using or whatever program somebody else is using, but perhaps what another interventionist is doing, they are making progress on. So I think we want to tailor it to the child's needs, is basically it, and then that also lays groundwork for then ongoing monitoring and progress too.
I think it's the involvement of the child, of the individual, is so important. It's never too young to say, do you like this? Do you think this helps? And I think that's so important. Just quick, Preeti, what was the other program you mentioned besides Kurzweil? I think someone wanted to look it up.
Inspirations.
Inspirations. There you go, Allison. And so we had another question just about a little bit more specific of types of modifications and accommodations. Sam, I'll just share some of the ones that I've seen. I know there might be a list of accommodations someone should get, but it is also different from what people actually get, what actually happens in the school or the colleges. So I'll start off with some, Sam, and then if you just want to jump in, and then Kristi and Preeti, if you want to throw in some more. So I know Preeti used, the most common type is extended time, but really that's useful when there is something impacting processing speed. So if you're processing information slowly, or if you struggle with processing or struggle with the reading and you have to read it multiple times, an accommodation of extended time helps there, because it's giving you the more time that your brain needs to do the same task that someone else can do shorter. It's no comment on intelligence. It's just how long it takes you. So use another analogy. If a car can go 140 miles an hour and another one can only go 100, you need to give the car that can only go 100 a little bit more time to catch up, to get to the same destination. There's some, and this is not one that often gets provided, but can be requested depending on how severe the disability, of like doing oral exams instead of written exams, having a reader that reads the questions to you. And these, each little thing can have such meaningful impact. Just having a question read to you can lead to like a 30-point increase on your scores that you're taking. It could be, can I have a scribe that writes for me? So someone that writes your answers and listens as you're presenting it. A big one is note taking, receiving copies of notes. A lot of students think this makes them stupid. But what I often say is if you can't comprehend what the teacher is saying accurately, you might be writing down inaccurate information, and you could do everything else right from that point on, but you're studying the wrong thing. And so getting copies of notes, it's also important just for people that might struggle with processing more than one thing at a time, having to listen, look, and write all at the same time. It's a heavy impact on working memory that's going to impact your ability to process all of this different information at once.
I feel like it's one of the most complex academic tasks there is. You have to listen, you have to hold it in short-term memory, you have motor output, you have executive functioning because you have to organize what's the use of notes if they're completely disorganized. So again, yeah, I it's one that we try to, I think, give a lot of psychoeducation to people about that. Yes, getting copies of notes or supports around that is really important because it really seemingly is, people will think, oh, I should be able to take notes, but it's actually incredibly complex task. Inherent to good learning.
There's also some text. Yep, there's also some text to voice. So the programs that were being mentioned have a text to voice component. And I'll pass it over in 1 second, but I do just want to share one thing about this is accommodations can only go so far. So I had someone that had a text to voice program in college, but she was in a psychology program. And she had to read a psychology textbook. And each chapter, and you had to read one chapter a week, was about 80 pages long, if not longer. And the text-to-voice document, the file, was 8 hours long. So accommodations can only go so far to level the playing field, but that doesn't mean that it makes all things equal and all things the same. So there's one aspect that accommodations can go, but the other aspect might also be trying to inform and control the education that you're working towards and just being aware of the impact that the accommodations don't make all things equal. They try to level the playing field. So, and any other accommodations that I missed that you guys think are important to share or modifications?
I think you make a good point. It's all about what are the obstacles that are preventing the student from accessing the curriculum or demonstrating knowledge. So I think another one that you may or may not have mentioned, Casey, was use of a computer, but a use of a computer in various contexts, right? So you may have use of a computer because you have dysgraphia and your handwriting is illegible. You may have use of a computer so that you can utilize technology such as spell check, speech to text, text to speech, audiobooks. So use of a computer, I think, is another big one. Separate location, even though it's not directly related necessarily to a to a learning disability, but sometimes with the separate location, it allows for the environment to be controlled so that the students have more time and have a distraction reduced environment so that they can utilize their energy to do an exam and focus on the actual material rather than the distractions that are around them. I think flexibility. Go ahead.
No, I was also going to say recording lectures. receiving notes in advance so you can preview the learning so that there's less capacity on learning everything at once. Those are two others. Text changes. So like having different programs installed on your computer, like dyslexia, I'm thinking of a specific font. These are all different types. Really what a lot of them are doing at the end of the day is trying to decrease what is expected all at one time and giving you more time to access. Notes before is just more time to read, to prepare, to comprehend.
To access, to practice, repetition, for sure,
Right. I mean, I think can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. I think we can we hear Kristi? Because I think she's saying something.
Can't hear Kristi. I don't know what happened.
Okay. Well, she figures that out.
I must
there we go.
hit a button. I apologize. Two that I'm not sure if they got mentioned, but breaks. So, and there's different types of breaks that can be utilized. So whether or not they're taking a break during an examination or so kind of giving them time to process or regroup. And another one, it comes, I think, a little bit more into play when we're talking about high stakes testing, but that's important, is a 4-function calculator is also an accommodation that often gets requested for kids. This is particularly helpful for kids that do not have automatic retrieval of their math facts, so basic calculation. And as Sam talked about earlier, we don't want them spending all of their energy on just figuring out what's 9 plus 7 using their fingers and counting, because if they make a mistake at that early stage, they're getting that problem wrong no matter what, if you make that early mistake. So those things that are kind of setting them up to be successful. And along with the separate room for testing, I find it also helpful. So for example, you talked about self-talk in the beginning, Casey. So I'll find sometimes I have kids who, if you allow them to talk out their work, talk through the process, for example, math is a great one. Calculation itself may not be a verbal task, but a word problem is. If they can talk it out and sort through it, you'd be surprised what adding language to a nonverbal task can do for some kids. So having that, and you can't do that in a classroom when you're testing with, 25, 30 other students. So sometimes allowing them to use language which may be a strength for them on a task that is not, even writing tasks, sometimes talking it out, those kids that are oral and can give you their essay beautifully when you just ask them to say it to you, allowing them to do that and then write their thoughts as they're speaking so that they can hear themselves talk. So that's another reason that a separate room can come into play as a helpful accommodation.
And
one of the first things, go ahead, Preeti.
Oh, no, go ahead. It looked like you were going to follow up on something she said, Casey, so I'll let you.
I was just going to say, it's one of the first things I do with people that have writer's block or struggle with writing. I'm like, just talk it out. And when I write things, they're like, oh my God, that's beautiful. I'm like, it's yours. Like, it's all yours.
I tell them to record themselves as well. So when they're talking, record themselves so they can hear and play back. Recording things. Again, it's not so much at the younger level that I find it as helpful as I do the older level, college kids. Recording lectures and having access to that after the fact so that they can listen and attend, because the amount of energy that they're expending on note taking, some of these kids, their notes may be beautiful, but they have no idea what the teacher said. They've sat there for minutes. They don't know what happened, but their notes are organized and they've just been writing furiously the whole time. So, kind of all those little things. And the last piece that I'll add about accommodations is that the idea behind all of them is that they should serve some purpose in aiding the child or adolescent with some functional limitation that they have. So it shouldn't just be, let's give them all these things in the hopes that one of them will tackle the problem. It should be serving a very specific purpose. So when I'm writing my recommendations, I'm not just writing they need extended time. I'm writing they need extended time because, so that it's very clear what it is that the accommodation is supposed to be accommodating and not just we're just giving it because, or we're requesting it just because.
So,
and I think,
No, I just wanted to get to this last question,
Mhm.
just for time's sake, and then the other questions that we can't get to, guys, will follow up afterwards. Um, so there's just one I'm going to answer just quick, and the second one I just wanted to bring up. So if a student has been foreign language exempt in high school, is there a list somewhere of colleges that would accept that exemption for admissions purposes? I don't know of a list. I also don't know of many colleges that have not allowed that accommodation.
Yeah.
They have to fill it with a different type of course. I don't. It looks like Kristi might be whipping out a list. If she does have one, that's
Well,
amazing.
I'm gonna admit I have not gotten. I just got this in my hand, so I've not gotten into it just yet. But this is a book that kind of goes through the colleges and what they offer for students that do have different learning disabilities. So I don't know, the person that asked that question may want to copy this title down and look into it. As I said, I just got it in my hand, so I haven't gone through this one to be able to speak to the foreign language piece for specific colleges. But and that's, again, it's not, you also shouldn't assume that something that you were given in high school you will automatically be granted at the college level. That's an assumption that I think can kind of hurt people sometimes. And so again, it's that's why people do updated evaluations and all of that. But there has to be, you have to demonstrate a clear need for the accommodation in order to be able to get it.
And I go.
Yeah, I just wanted to get the last one before people hop off. I didn't want this person to hop off. So any thoughts on deadline extensions for assignments for students who have LD? This doesn't always help if the student doesn't manage time well. So I get, like, if it's not like a language-based learning disability, if we're talking about LD in general, my basic view, and if you guys disagree on any of this, please do, the extension should be already built in to their due date. It shouldn't be, oh, if I don't get it done on time, I can ask for 3 more days. It's got to be, you have the 3 days, that's your new deadline. And it's just because you don't always have just a safety net. You don't just always have, well, if I don't do my job, I have extra time. And so that's just my philosophy on it. But the one thing I will say is if they're at a level of anxiety, not so much about their learning difference, but if they're super anxious about deadlines, that's different. So it's extensions could have a place where a student doesn't think if they don't get something in, it's the end of the world and they can't think of anything else. That might make sense there. But for learning differences of just you need more time for assignments, like you need an extra week for an essay, I could be cool with that. But it's got to be very, and Kristi said it, seconding Kristi, got to be very targeted to the reason, like, and not just a blank.
My question would be, why would they need an additional week? Like, what would that week do for them? What would be different? And so kind of coming at it from that angle, because and it can backfire with anxiety as well. Sometimes getting those extensions actually ends up increasing the anxiety, it prolongs it. So again, has to be, I think, specific to each child and what's going to work best for them.
Right. I also, this is, there's a lot of accommodations, which I won't waste time talking, that, word prediction software for kids who have the verbal fluency, things like that, when they're having to write essays as kids get older, bunch of different things. But the one thing I do want to say about all of these accommodations, especially as kids get older and we're talking about college level kids, is sort of the metacognitive process that we're all talking about, executive functioning, learning how you learn. So part of the process is not just about accommodations and remediation, all that. Part of it is also the ongoing evaluation of, are these things working for me? Are they working for my child? So going back to the extended deadline assignments, what Kristi just said, what are we using it for? And if we need that, was there something that we did that we were suggesting, or a method that was using that perhaps is not as efficient as something else, and we need to modify that? Because again, otherwise that's going to be a recipe for constantly feeling behind too. You want them to stay on track with their peers and their classmates. So I would wonder if that's coming up a lot. Let's step back, big picture, and look, what are we doing that maybe we need to change in the process along the way to make everything go a little bit more smoothly. And so that's where, you know, we can make a lot of recommendations, but sometimes we just have to try things out. And it goes back to something Casey said about, does the student like it? Does it work for them? Do they jive well with it? Maybe a certain program, it's just not user friendly for them. So that's where the ongoing sort of assessment or evaluation of helping them understand how they learn, learning how they learn, and then being able to step back and use some of those executive skills, develop those executive skills to advocate and evaluate when their processes aren't working very well and we need to change those up. And that should hopefully help minimize the need for some of those extended deadlines, hopefully. That's sort of.
And I think I love ending these on like a positive note about the journey that we all go through. Look at the silver linings here. Parents, talk to your kids about, we don't know what's going to work, but we're going to figure it out. We're going to keep trying. Professionals, reiterating, if this doesn't work, there's something else we can try. And this is where those with diagnosed disabilities can actually get a leg up over some of their peers. It doesn't come easy. They build their resilience, they build grit. They have the practice to be learning from a young age that this didn't work for you, what else can we do? Whereas quote unquote neurotypical peers, it's all designed to work for them and they don't have to try hard and try different things.
100%.
So if we could start early with that growth mindset, then we can really set them up for success through the lifespan.
Absolutely.
And so on that, I want to thank all of you. Thank you, Preeti. Thank you, Kristi. Thank you, Sam.
Thanks for having us.
I look forward to more.
For having us.
We got some great additional questions, and we're going to loop back with everyone after the webinar. And I already have some ideas for future ones coming up. Math focused is definitely going to be one. And I think it's great things to explore. So thank you again, guys, and I hope everyone gets to enjoy the weather wherever you are.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Casey. Thanks, Sam.